Hi, and welcome back to my channel, where I'll be walking you through the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition Critical Role's Call of the Netherdeep campaign module. The Call of the Netherdeep was released in March of 2022, and is an adventure campaign guide that takes place in the world of Exandria. As I was reviewing the complete module, I came to the conclusion that it was going to be a very complex module to run, and as such, I rate this as an intermediate or higher level campaign. Someone who is just starting out as a dungeon master is going to struggle to run through this campaign, and while it's not impossible to do, a new DM is going to have issues tracking all of the facets of the campaign that need to be kept in mind. It uses a group of rivals to turn the entire campaign into a long-running race or versus campaign that has many different potential outcomes at the conclusion of each chapter. Tracking those outcomes is going to be the trickiest part of the whole campaign, in addition to tracking the rivals, but I will do my best to provide some guidance on how to keep all of that straight. Additionally, this module connects the players to a significant event in Exandrian history called the Calamity, though several centuries after the events themselves have occurred. It does this through a series of 7 segmented adventures, although technically they're all linked together. It's a continuous chain, and they're organized by chapter. It is all going to start with level 3 characters and progress them all the way through to level 12. The adventures set the party on a course that reveals more about the Calamity, while gaining an understanding of a creature called the Apotheon, and how Elixion, as he was once known, saved Exandria from total destruction. His fate, however, is now placed into the hands of the party as they attempt to either save him from his torment or destroy him. Once again, there are going to be 2 versions of this video. A shorter version of the video is going to expose you to the module and what it encompasses for a series of adventures. The second version of this video is going to be much longer, and it will go into more detail in some areas, offering suggestions on a few things, indicating a few things to keep in mind, and even potentially provide a few examples. I will be sure to cross-link each video so that you can access the other version of the video from the one you are currently watching, therefore you can get the full context of what you're looking for. This video is going to be slightly different from the other walkthroughs I've completed thus far, and it's to test if the content provides the information you might be looking for in a more appropriate format. If you are not a dungeon master, this video should be safe to watch, but you might want to skip the chapter sections if you want to avoid any spoilers. Mainly because I will be using those chapter sections to point out the key areas a dungeon master is going to need to pay attention to. This video is a sponsored video, as Smiteworks was kind enough to provide this module in order for me to complete this walkthrough. As you know, I've been publishing videos on the Smiteworks channel for a few months. And when I publish a companion video on my channel for a module that Smiteworks has provided to me, I must disclose the state of that sponsorship as per Canadian regulations. While I am not directly affiliated with Smiteworks at this time, I do work with them in collaboration to provide this content to you, specifically for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition based modules at this time. The module itself is on both the Fantasy Grounds store and the Steam Marketplace, including both of the bundles that are available for the Completionist bundle on each marketplace. So if you already have a large number of modules and wish to save some additional cash, you can make use of those bundles to do so. However, you should be aware that this module does not fully function properly for the most part without the Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, and the Monster's Manual, and I highly recommend purchasing those additional modules if you do not already own them. The reason is because there are some references to various tables, items, and creatures or NPCs that were simply linked to the existing elements in those modules. Additionally, another supplemental module, called the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, provides more information about the world of Exandria. However, it is not required in order to play through this module, but I still recommend picking it up as well in order to provide a fuller picture of what the world itself looks like. Due to the way that this module was converted, you might also require the art subscription to be able to load some of the maps that are used within Fantasy Grounds Unity. Unfortunately, however, it's not clear what map packs those are actually required for, so I am unable to provide links to the specific packs that might help to reduce that cost over time. You will find links in the description of this video for all of the modules, bundles, as well as the art subscription to ensure that you have quick access to all of the above resources. In order for you to be able to load the module, you will first have to have purchased it through the links I provided earlier, as well as run the Fantasy Grounds Unity Updater utility. This will make the module available to Fantasy Grounds Unity through the library category, specifically within the modules panel. If you've never run Fantasy Grounds Unity as a DM before, you will most likely not have any modules loaded, as you can see here on my screen. To do that, you will need to click on the activation button here down at the bottom left of this modules panel. Over time, as you purchase more modules, you will eventually find that the module activation window can get a little cluttered. So the easiest method to find the module that you're looking for is down here in the search box at the bottom left of the screen. All we have to do is type in the keyword Nether, and we'll see the modules that we want to be able to load into Fantasy Grounds. All you then have to do is simply click on the load button. And depending on how recent your system is, that can take some time to complete, so don't panic if it appears to be taking a little bit of time. As this module does have other dependencies, this is also a good time to load the Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, and the Monster's Manual, and if you happen to have it, the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount. I won't be doing that as part of this video, just so that I can show you all of the elements that are unique to this particular supplement. One thing I do want to point out here though, is that even though there is a player's version of this particular module, all it really does is supply images to the player for a couple of items that are introduced as part of this particular module. It's entirely up to you as to whether you enable that so that players can load it, or whether you yourself even load it. So as a Dungeon Master, if you want to keep things minimal, you don't necessarily need it, but it's there if you want it. All it will do is prevent the players from actually being able to see those images, so no harm done. The Call of the Netherdeep module provides all of the story elements, save for some of the creatures and items, that are used to run the player through this particular epic set of quests. There are a number of panels that will contain important information that you might want to reference at some point, and they are as follows. Within the Encounters panel, you're going to find all of the pre-generated encounters associated with various locations of this campaign module. The Images panel is going to show you a digital copy of all of the images that you would normally see in the printed and PDF versions of the supplement. The Items panel itself is going to show you all of the items the party can find throughout the various adventures, as well as some basic equipment. The NPCs panel is going to contain all of the information sheets and stat blocks for all of the various NPCs the party is going to encounter as provided by this module. It does not, if you don't have the other elements loaded, include anything from the Monster's Manual or the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Parcels panel is going to find everything that you are going to award to the party as some kind of loot parcel found throughout the various adventures. Within the Story panel, you are going to find all of the information sheets that are going to guide you through this epic campaign, as well as all of the reference material to help you understand the adventure and how it connects to Exandria. Within the Tables panel, you're going to find some of the random roll tables that are used at various stages of the module, be they by the party or by you in relation to how things might affect the party in some way, shape, or form. And finally, I need to point out that this module does not contain quest items that are usually found in various modules, and that is primarily due to the fact that this module is geared, for the most part, on leveling up characters through specific points within the epic arc. And as usual, all of these particular panels are available from the category campaign here, and if you don't have it expanded out, all you have to do is click it to drop that down. Due to the level of complexity of this particular campaign, the place you're going to want to start is going to be within the reference manual that is actually published as part of this module. You can find that by clicking on the Adventure Campaign Guide here and access the reference manual in order to pop that open. As a Dungeon Master, I recommend that you start with the introduction. Well, it's obvious, I mean, it's called the introduction. That's generally where you would figure you would start. But in this case, it's extremely important because it's going to give you the background on Exandria if you don't already have that knowledge. It's also going to fill in other information that you're going to need in order to properly run this campaign. And that's the purpose of the reference manual. It's a really good place to start because it's going to provide you a broken out table of contents via the left side menu and give you an easy means to move through the chapters as you read through them. The story panel also works, but you have to work at it in order to find the information that you're going to be looking for. However, you can reduce some of the workload of trying to find the information by clicking on this little drop-down menu up here so that you can actually focus on the individual chapters that you're going to want to review. So this section here covers everything that is part of the introduction. This section here is essentially an overview or a table of contents of everything that you're going to get involved with in relation to the module. whereas the other ones are all the chapters that are associated with each of the individual adventures that you're going to be putting the party through. Although they're not technically individual adventures per se, they are in the way that they're organized by chapter, but really it's one long epic campaign that is separated out into various chapters and broken up into multiple paths because of that structure. I highly recommend that you read through this introduction chapter a couple of times until you have a really good handle on the information stored within it. And that's because it covers a lot of the history that you're going to need to know in relation to Exandria itself, as well as the various regions that the campaign takes place in. Additionally, it provides details about the Apotheon and other elements of this particular campaign that you as a Dungeon Master are going to have to really understand. These concepts can directly affect the party members in different ways, and you're going to have to understand how those effects are going to come into play. Things like corruption of the players, the rival party that they're going to have to deal with throughout the campaign, as well as providing rules on how to handle many of the aspects of the environment that the player is going to have to work their way through. As the campaign begins with the world of Exandria, I highly recommend you go over the details of the Calamity itself that are both covered in this module as well as within the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount if you happen to have it. This is because the Calamity is one of the key concepts that you are going to have to understand in relation to this campaign, as it's going to directly affect party members with its after effects, which I will cover in a moment. If you do have access to Wildemount, then pay attention to the Welcome chapter as well as run through chapters 1 and 2. These chapters, combined with all of the information in the introduction chapter of the Call of the Netherdeep module, should give you enough history and understanding of Exandria itself in order to be able to run this campaign smoothly. At the very least, you should be aware of where to look when you get asked a question that you don't immediately have an answer for. At the same time, it might not be a bad idea to create a distilled note that actually contains all of the information that the party is going to need to know in advance of the campaign, and that they can reference when they need to. This is going to save you from having to answer a lot of questions that the characters themselves are going to have to know in general, meaning that the players might not know it, but their characters do. And you can always modify it to add in new information for something that the party asked about and you hadn't actually thought of that as some of the background information that you've provided them. Some suggestions that I recommend putting in this note are as follows. The first is a basic understanding of the overall history of Exandria. Unless a character is not from Exandria, they're going to have some general knowledge about the world itself. They're also going to know some details about what the Calamity was. They might not know everything because a lot of that is going to be buried in the history books, but for those characters who studied history, they're going to know it. You should also include some basic information about the 2 moons that orbit Exandria. There's not going to be a lot of detail that you're going to want to add here, but you will want to add some to really address those basic elements that someone might actually know just off the street. You're also going to want to include details about the various regions that they could potentially travel to. Not a whole lot of information, but just enough to cover awareness that they know that things like that exist. And you could even throw in some random rumors in there to add a little bit of confusion to it as well. Who knows, it might add a little bit of fun to the adventure down the road. The next aspect of this campaign that you're going to want to become very familiar with are all of the locations that the party is going to travel to, such as Jigao, Bazzoxan, even some of the regions such as Xhorhas. This will allow you to guide the party to where they need to go and give you enough of a visual framework to be able to clearly articulate these locations, as well as provide some of that atmospheric description that they're going to need to set them in the immersive aspect of that location. An example is that the first campaign starts in Jigao at the time of a particular festival. So when you're explaining the various areas of Jigao to the players as they approach or pass by them, you'll want to convey the festive nature of these locations in a way that makes the players feel they are actually there. The third aspect of the campaign that you're going to want to get a good understanding of is the effects of ruidium and how that corruption could affect the players, as well as how they can be resisted, or in the event of being infected by this corruption, how they can be cured. The one thing that is not obvious is how that corruption comes into play, specifically in relation to the characters. And this is because it only comes into play where the party is actually using items that are made of ruidium or entering a region that is so heavily suffused with ruidium that it requires saving throws to prevent that corruption from affecting those players. For example, in the information sheet for the Ring of Red Fury, you will find a ruidium corruption element that details how that ring can corrupt a player. From an environmental point of view, the Temple of the Archheart provides an example of how an environmental effect is going to come into play, and I've highlighted that on the screen. The last element you will want to become intimately familiar with is with the rival party, as you will need to make use of these characters and the party as a whole at various locations within the campaign. This is because these rivals are meant to push, challenge, hinder, or even outright attack the player party, depending on the disposition each rival gains towards the players. This is an aspect of the campaign that you are going to have to track as a Dungeon Master, and you are going to have to do it for each member of the rival party, as will become evident in the first campaign chapter. I recommend utilizing the in-game notes capabilities here in order to track that information, and you can create a note sheet, if you will, per rival member, or spread it out as a single note and just reference each rival member within that note. It's entirely up to you. You could even use a story element to do that, but I recommend notes just to separate it from the story aspect of it. However, you are going to have to track how each rival member feels about each party member on an individual basis, so that's where the complexity comes into play. You will also want to ensure that you collect and track each stat block for each of those rivals, and we'll see how to do that a little bit later on in the video. And that is simply because you're going to have to constantly reference them as the campaign moves forward. So rather than have to go digging for it every single time, it's a good idea to centralize that in one spot. Once you have the players and their characters are created and ready to go, I recommend you hold what's called a Session 0. The reason I suggest doing this after the characters are created is to ensure the party members are able to fully pay attention to what you're going to explain to them. You can use this session to set up guidelines for what the players are going to be comfortable with, as there are quite a few darker elements that are presented as part of this campaign. However, this session is more about a knowledge transfer of sorts, as there are a number of things that the players are going to need to know in advance of the campaign. And this gives you the perfect opportunity to make the party aware of those quote-unquote distilled notes that you've provided for them, if you chose to do that, as well as add new information to them in the event that they are asking questions that you didn't add as part of that distilled note section. And you're going to get those questions here because this is primarily when the party is going to first receive this information, and that's just naturally going to trigger questions. It'll be up to you to decide if the answers to those questions, however, are generic enough to be added to the common history reference section of that particular distilled notes, if you will. This way, you can set the groundwork for the campaign and ensure the players are all on the same level of knowledge about the world of Exandria, the regions that they hail from, and the locales that they have been traveling through to get to Jigao. This is also a good time to run through some of the aspects of the pronunciation guide that you see here in order to be able to allow the players to pronounce very specific words and what they mean, as well as add them to the reference sheet. If at a later point in time you introduce a new player into the campaign, maybe due to player rotation for example, then you're going to want to have a solo session with them where you go through all of these same details as well as point them to the reference notes to get them up to speed as quickly as possible. And again, this should be done after they've created their character. To do this, I highly recommend you create a note for all of the rules that the party has agreed upon, as well as any other relevant information that is not covered by the reference note, and this could include a history of what the party has done thus far. It might seem like a lot of work up front, but it will actually save you time later on because you'll be able to simply refer the players to those notes if they happen to ask a question that you've already addressed with those notes. The first chapter, called A Fateful Competition, is where the story is going to begin, and it starts in a city called Jigao, which is on the northern coast of Xhorhas, where the river Ifilon meets the ocean. You can find this chapter via the reference manual or through the story panel, though it won't be immediately visible because what you have to do is actually drop this down in order to gain access to it. That's not it. There it is. Sorry, I still had my previous keyword search in there. This chapter is broken into two parts, with the first being a set of competitions that take place within the town of Jigao, and the second being a dungeon dive in order to complete the first quest of the campaign. As a Dungeon Master, you are going to want to pay close attention to the running this chapter section, because it's going to provide the details about how this chapter is going to work for you. Additionally, this is the chapter where you use the group of rivals that the party is going to constantly run up against throughout various portions of this module for the very first time. And because of that, I recommend that you let the party know in advance that it's going to take a little bit of time to get used to actually utilizing these rivals, and that way they have a level of expectation that is set in advance. As I indicated earlier, this first part of the campaign begins with a series of competitions one might usually find at a carnival or festival, and they are mini games that the party members can actually compete in. How many of these you run should really be up to the players, as they are only going to play those that they feel are enjoyable. There is no need to play through all of the games unless the party themselves wants to, and if you feel that the session is taking too long, you can have Elder Ushru summon the participants to a centralized meeting area where you can begin to move the campaign forward again. The second portion of this chapter is about a race through an underwater grotto, and this is where you as the Dungeon Master are going to have to keep a close eye on how long it takes for that party to move through each room. Each section of the grotto has a specific number of rounds it takes for the party to pass through, in addition to other challenges that might actually crop up. The challenge for you is also keeping track of the rivals as they pass through another aspect of the grotto, and calculating who is going to arrive at the final room first. I recommend that you make use of a non-public note, and as each party moves through a particular room, you simply make note of the room as well as how long it took for that party to pass through it. Doing so will allow you to keep a mental picture of where each party is within the grotto, and for the rivals you can use a particular token if you wish to be able to track them outside of the visual range of where the players can see. Lastly, the chapter provides two possible outcomes from the results of the final contest, and it's either going to be where the party is victorious or they're not. And those two outcomes branch out into actually three outcomes. So the party either succeeds, the rivals have succeeded, or something in between, and I'm going to let you figure out what that is. As a result, it provides some suggestions on how to keep the campaign moving forward, but you are still free to use your own guidance here, as these might not cover how your party has completed the story of this particular chapter. With respect to the festival games, I'm only going to provide a single example on how one might work, and this is to save exposing too much information about the module to players who might be watching this particular video. The games associated with the various aspects of the festival all make use of the ability score checks or saving throws in order to determine the progression of each game. As such, these can be treated as encounters within Fantasy Grounds Unity, and in fact, the encounters are already set up for you. The game that I'm going to show you is the Best Pies in the Jumble. And the encounter for it is a little bit ways down here on this particular page. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this encounter, and we can see that the various characters that come into play for this particular contest are right here. I've gone ahead and loaded up two characters that I believe I created quite a while ago, and I'm going to use these as an example for this particular encounter, if you will. As such, at this point, all I have to do is simply click this little arrow down here at the bottom of our encounter panel, and it will automatically populate and roll the initiatives of all of the NPCs that are now added to our combat tracker. Not all of the NPCs in this particular game are taking part of the actual game. They're not contestants. Agatha Silverspoon, for example, is the quote-unquote game master of this particular game. So she's not going to be involved in actually rolling any dice, but what she's going to be doing is, and the reason why she's in this combat tracker, is she's going to be ruling on things as they progress over the course of each round. Her primary role is really to keep the contestants in line and act as an announcer as the contest progresses forward, in addition to all of the stuff that I've already stated. So that means as a Dungeon Master that you might want to add a little bit of festival flair here while you're trying to roleplay Agatha during this particular session, but that's entirely up to you. You don't necessarily have to. It does add to a little bit of the immersion though. The three remaining contestants, the Drow, the Halfling, and the Human Adventurer, they are contestants that are actively going through and attempting to win this particular contest. And there are really two ways that the contest can be run while using the combat tracker. The first is to make use of the rounds themselves and have both the party and the NPCs roll initiative, and simply cycle through each of the contestants. Now, the NPCs here in this case already have initiative, but I might choose to ignore that. That's entirely up to me. The other option is to not really utilize rounds, but simply have everybody make a roll, and you look at the results of those particular rolls and to determine whether there is someone who succeeded or whether there is someone who had failed. Anyone who fails their check can be removed from the combat tracker, and this is going to work regardless of whether you're using the rounds individually or just simply tracking each contestant and seeing how they do. As for making those saving throws or ability checks, you're going to want to check the reference sheet specific to this story element, so it can either be done through the story panel, or in this case I'm using the reference manual to do this. You're going to want to scroll down here into the section called Putting Away the Pies, as this is going to explain how the actual ability score check is going to work. In this case, it's a constitution check, and it starts at 8. And for every single pie, after the second pie, it's going to start increasing by 2. What this means is that the first 2 rounds will simply require a DC of 8 in order to pass the check. After that, now it's going to go up to a 10, a 12, a 14, a 16, etc., etc. The second aspect to this is that if they happen to fail their ability score check, so in other words, they rolled a 8 or lower, a 7 or lower in this particular case, then what's going to happen is you then have to have them make a DC 15 Constitution saving throw. Otherwise, they are going to be poisoned for approximately an hour. Essentially, you're simulating that they're going to be queasy over the course of that hour. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pop open our contestants. There we go. And then I'm simply going to click on the Constitution check here. I'm going to start with the Drow. They failed. They failed. And they failed. So right away, the only contestants left are the 3 players. But each of these particular characters now has to make a Constitution-based saving throw. They are now queasy. They are also now queasy, and the human adventurer is also queasy. That's all unfortunate. What I can then do is simply delete each of these contestants here, because they are no longer in the contest. Now I have to roll these, considering that I'm still in the first quote-unquote pie in relation to this contest. I'm just being efficient in dealing with any removals. On the player side, I'm going to simply have our contestants roll their checks. Okay, they succeeded. And they succeeded. So both of our contestants have moved forward. To indicate that, what you want to do is actually simulate that you ran the round, just to indicate how many particular passes you've gone through and done, regardless of whether you're utilizing rounds or not. This way you know exactly how many pies they're on. So in this case, they'd be on the second pie. That means it's still a DC 8 check. Alright, so we have now had Indivin fail, which means she now needs to roll a particular saving throw. Specifically the Constitution-based saving throw. That is unfortunately a queasy effect that has to go on her. Now, because that is a player character, that player character is going to be queasy for pretty much a duration. What I want to then do is simply look for the poisoned effect here and drop it onto Indivin. Because if they decide to go on to another contest, that has to come into play. But with this one round done, I'm going to delete our final failed contestant. That leaves us with Velamin as the winner of this contest. So they will now receive whatever reward is associated with this particular game. But I'm not going to show that on this particular recording simply because I don't want to spoil that for any player. With respect of the race through the grotto, this is going to be tracked by the total number of rounds it takes for the players to traverse a given room within that grotto. It is possible for 4 potential scenarios when it comes to the final room in the grotto, and they are as follows. The first is that the party arrives first, and the rivals eventually follow sometime later. The second is that the party has arrived first, and the rivals don't show at all. This only applies if you simulate what the rivals do in each room, and if they run into problems that don't allow them to continue. The third is that the party and the rivals all arrive at the same time. And the last is that the party arrives after the rivals themselves. Each room in the grotto can have a set number of rounds for the party to traverse through that particular room, based on if they succeed or fail a given check. However, many also have additional challenges that crop up while the party moves through a given room, and those rounds are in addition to the base value of the room. For instance, if a room takes 3 rounds to traverse, but also has a challenge that took a given group 5 rounds to complete, then the total traversal time for that room is 8 rounds. Most have a value for a success of the check or saving throw, and another for a party that has failed a check or saving throw. For example, on that, a room might have a 2-turn traversal time in the event that they succeeded on their particular saving throws, or a 3 or higher value for anyone who happens to fail their saving throw or their check. The total number of rounds it takes for the party to arrive at the room marked as E10 determines what happens when that party arrives in that room. And I'm intentionally not showing the map here just to avoid spoilers, nor am I showing the actual chapter reference specific to E10, just because I don't want to spoil anything for the players. And while the campaign module recommends tracking the rivals as well, their total is essentially ignored, as it's the party's own total number of rounds that indicate what actually happens when they arrive. Additionally, while I point out that there are 4 potential outcomes, the campaign guide only covers 3 of those outcomes, and that's because the intent is that the rivals do not die during the first quest of the campaign. I hope the above explanation helps provide an example of how this works, because I'm intentionally avoiding going over each room of the grotto in detail to avoid spoilers. The descriptions within each room, though, do a very good job of explaining how a given room works, so you should be okay as long as you pay attention to the details. And that about sums up the key concepts that you'll need to keep an eye on during this chapter, and I don't want to spoil anything else in relation to it, so let's move on. With Chapter 2, it's all about getting to Bazzoxan, which is the next key interest point for the campaign, and as such, this could be a single session, as it's primarily a traveling scenario with a few encounters along the way. Once again, focus on the running this chapter and after the festival sections, as they will explain how you should start this part of the adventure based entirely on the outcome from Chapter 1. However, you'll also want to pay very close attention to the details in the after the festival section of this chapter, as that's going to set the path the party is on. It really comes down to whether the party was able to acquire the Jewel of the 3 Prayers, or if the rivals did, and as well as what the demeanors of those rivals are towards the party. And this is going to be an overriding concept that you're going to have to deal with for each chapter, and this is a good one to set a few habits right off the get-go that will allow you to track the states of things over the life of the campaign. We've already talked about tracking the demeanor of the rivals of the party, and this is going to be required over the entire duration of the campaign, but you'll also want to start tracking where you think the rival party is in relation to the players. Is the rival party ahead of where the players group is? Are they chasing after them? Or did they agree to travel alongside the group? These are all things that you have to take into account. This, in combination with the individual demeanor of a rival party member towards one or more of the players themselves, is going to provide you the content to interact with the party members going forward through this chapter. Essentially, it's how are you going to roleplay that particular rival party member in relation to interactions with a given party member. Of course, that's in addition to the content of the camp that the party is most likely going to spend a night or two at in this particular chapter. The other main element of this chapter are the random encounters that will happen. It is clearly defined as to how many there will be as the party moves towards Bazzoxan, and it all comes down to how fast that party is traveling. By the start of this chapter, the party should already be at level 4, and should be able to handle most of the encounters that they will run up against, though some of them will be very difficult encounters. Early on in the review material, the guide indicates that you should use the Xhorhas encounters table to help add some variety to this section of the campaign. What is not immediately obvious is that each of these encounters maps to a section defined here in this set of chapters, and don't worry about running the party into a creature that is well past their ability to handle at this point. That is because the chapter is set up to provide some excitement while keeping the party moving forward, but the encounters are also fairly well balanced to provide assistance to the party at just the right time, or maybe that assistance is already right on the field. However, it is possible for the party to completely tangent at this point, or even completely wipe out, but that's the nature of D&D campaigns, and they can essentially go the way the dice choose to roll. If the party wipes, and they are having a lot of fun during the campaign, don't worry, as it might be feasible for them to be rescued by one of the patrols that constantly roam around the area. However, take the delay of that into account and ensure it's added to the overall travel time associated with the party, as it might put them well behind the rival group at this point, thus adding pressure to the party to catch up. How you handle this section is going to be entirely up to you, but the overall goal is to get the party to Bazzoxan either on their own or with the assistance of others. In relation to Chapter 3, this is the chapter where the party is going to find their direction, and is introduced to the concepts of factions with whom they either gain favor with or run afoul of. The effects, due to the disposition of the factions towards the party member, won't come into play until much later in the campaign, but this is where they can actually start that foundational structure to those relationships that will either hinder or help them later on. This is a very large and potentially complicated chapter to deal with, and by the time the party reaches this area, they should be level 5. It's also a good idea to have the party members apply their levels before you start this chapter, as there will be a few challenging encounters that they're going to bump up against as soon as they arrive. Also, due to the number of potential encounters and mini-quests that happen in this city, the party should be able to reach level 7 before they leave it. To clarify that, you should refer to the Running the Adventure section within the introduction chapter to find the table that explains when level 6 and level 7 should be rewarded. This is also going to be the first time where the rivals have a change within their own stat blocks, and you will need to replace any links or references you've been using to gain access to the Tier 2 equivalents. Once again, you should go over the Running this chapter section and study the layout of the city, as well as go over the Bazzoxan overview section of this chapter several times before you run this party through it. It will reduce the amount of delay in dealing with finding relevant information that you might be looking for, and it will prepare you for handling the various directions the parties can take. And this is because this chapter does not function in a linear fashion. It's in this chapter that the rival party also either coalesces into a solid group or breaks down and creates avenues for internal strife. This should be tracked alongside the rest of the data you are keeping specific to the rival party, and these changes are going to become important later on in the campaign. My recommended approach to this is to make use of notes you've already been using and should already be using to simply expand out the level of detail you're taking in relation to each of the overall rivals. You can also add in things about faction members, as well as resident NPCs that you feel the party will most likely continue to interact with. As this is the last chapter that is going to take place on the Wildmount continent, you should provide the party time to be able to close off any outstanding issues if possible, though some avenues of this chapter might actually not give the party that chance. Once they've completed this chapter, they will move on to Marquette in order to continue tracking down the information that they will need, and continue on with the rest of the adventure. Even though this chapter has a number of different paths that the party can take, they are all clearly covered within the context of the sections specific to those confrontations or directions, specifically next steps, which I'm going to leave for you to explore, as I don't really want to spoil everything during this video. As discussed earlier, before I move on to the next section, I want to go over a few additional points that should help you out. With respect to finding the NPC stat blocks for the rival party members, all you have to do is pop open the NPC panel and search for the rival names associated with that particular character. And what you will find is that you will have a tiered set of stat blocks here. And in this case, at this particular point in the chapter, you should be looking at the Tier 2 stat block. And once you've found them, simply go ahead and link them into your information page that you're tracking all of these details so that you don't have to go find them later on. Another thing that I want to point out is that the party is really meant to explore this city. And as such, when you're ready to push the party forward, you're going to have to make sure that you move them in the direction that you want them to go. Otherwise, you could spend months and months here, depending on how long or how often you meet. But they should be given time to go to the areas that are not always going to be covered by the campaign guide. And this is a really good place to add in a few side quests if you're one of the DMs who likes to do that and make those campaigns a little bit more personal for your players. They should also meet the various faction members and deal with a large number of events that actually take place while they're there. But how they handle them can actually affect the various NPCs' perceptions of the players, and this is really important. They're going to relate back to the points of view that each rival member is going to maintain in relation to each player. And that's going to be something that will come to a head, if you will, later on in the campaign. By combining all of that information into a single information sheet, what you're going to be able to do is quickly get back up to speed before each session. And it's going to put you in the right mindset to handle any of the situations that the party might create when it relates to a given faction or rival member. Beyond that, once you feel the party has spent more than sufficient time in the city and has gleaned as much information as they're going to be able to do, then it's time to move them on to the next chapter. This chapter, specifically chapter 4, is where the meat of the campaign begins to really take shape, and it's where the party is going to gain stronger relationships with one or more of the factions that are going to either help them move towards their overall goal or hinder them at some point in the future. The relationships developed by the party while they were in Bazzoxan carry forward into this chapter, and they help with the initial groundwork on opening doors with one or more of those factions. It should also allow the players the choice of what faction that they want to gain closer ties with, unless they really badly burned bridges with the given faction in previous chapters. If they did completely sour a particular relationship with a faction, it is possible these factions are now hostile to the party and will most likely remain so during the remaining duration of the campaign, unless steps are actually taken to try to mend those social bridges. This chapter also pushes the player level up to level 8, and once they've completed a number of faction missions, sets the groundwork to reach level 9, although they won't actually reach level 9 until they get into chapter 5. Beyond that, the party should have some level of freedom to move about the city, and the factions can be used as guideposts in order to move the campaign forward when you feel they've had enough downtime or resolve some specific aspects of information gathering that is now going to allow them to move forward. Running this chapter is extremely similar to the previous chapter, so as long as you pay attention to all of the same points that you paid attention to there, although updated them to the factions that are here, you should be pretty good in relation to running this chapter. Before I get into some additional points, I want to clarify one thing. This is really going to be the city where the party can go through and arm up. This is going to be the one that's going to be rich enough to have all of the equipment that they're going to need. However, it's not going to be the last bastion. They will pick up additional equipment as loot items, depending on where they go in the other sections, but you're going to want to give them the opportunity to execute a shopping spree here while they're here in this particular city. As for the few additional points that I'd like to make in relation to this particular section, they all relate to the rivals and the factions. The only real complicated part of this particular chapter is going to be running the specific faction quests and tracking the overall status of those relationships, and allowing the party to capitalize on those relationships. If, however, you've run the Waterdeep Dragon Heist module, the faction quests work in a similar fashion, though there are a few differences. In this case, many of the quests are internalized in some way and only really touch on any political aspects of it in relation to the city around them. Whereas the Waterdeep module, they definitely dealt with a lot heavier impacts in relation to the overall politics of things. The one thing you'll want to do, though, is simply take your time and plan out the potential points of interaction with these factions, as well as make copious notes on how you're going to be role-playing each member of those given factions, because it could get a little awkward when the party returns to a faction, and all of a sudden what used to be one kind of accent is now another, or one kind of quote-unquote behavior is now another. As for the rivals, their involvement is less obvious than it has been in previous chapters, and they kind of fade a little bit into the background and don't really become too heavily involved with anything that the party might want to do. Think of this city as the rivals' quote-unquote home base, and they're really just kind of relaxing before they move on to the next section of the campaign. However, that does depend on the demeanor between the two parties, and your note should provide enough indication as to what those rivals are going to do, and you can use that information in combination with the rivals and Anchorel section of this particular chapter. By combining that information, you can really figure out what those rival party members will do while they're in the city. If they just simply fade into the background, okay, that's perfectly fine. If, however, they're going to be constantly into the party's face, well, you'll have to figure out how you're going to deal with that. And this is primarily because the factions are the main driving force of the story in this chapter. And while the rivals, they might make the odd appearance or have a known location where they can be found, they don't really get involved with those faction quests unless the party directly involves them. But that covers the extra little bit of information that I wanted to impart upon you before moving on to the next chapter. So let's go ahead and move on. Chapter 5 is where the party can finally begin to capitalize on the various relationships that they've built with those factions in the previous two chapters, as well as with the rivals if they are on good terms with them. This is also where the rivals make a bit more of a return into the overall appearance within the chapter, and it might even be the first time the party bumps into them again after Bazzoxan. Additionally, the rivals will now have upgraded to their final stat block, and it's the tier 3 version of their characters. And they have now also hit their final emotional and psychological states of mind that can really impact how each rival member behaves. And this is the most complicated chapter when it comes to role-playing the rivals, as you're going to have to find a way to convey those emotions and psychological states to the party players as they interact with those rivals. In any event, however, this chapter is mostly a dungeon crawl, the results of which will set the framework for the final chapters. The party will have the potential to obtain levels 9 and 10 during this chapter if they meet the conditions defined by the character advancement table of the introduction running the adventure section. Much like Chapter 4, the party can take multiple avenues in relation to gathering the information that they need, and as such, the party should spend quite a bit of time here in this chapter. Other groups might simply skip a good portion of this particular chapter and blitz through the areas that are leading to Chapter 7, so the DM is going to have to deal with things a little bit differently during this chapter depending on how the party runs through it. And once again, I'm avoiding going into too much in the way of detail here because I don't want to spoil anything for a player who might be watching, or for a DM who wants to find out how this adventure progresses on their own, because that's what this is it's an adventure progression chapter. The good thing for you is that this chapter does provide a nice, detailed overview of Kael Marrow. At least I think that's how it's pronounced. That's how the pronunciation guide shows that I should be pronouncing it, so I'm hoping I'm doing it right. But you should be able to read that section multiple times to accommodate the different directions the players could take. By studying this section and gaining confidence as how to roleplay the various rivals, you'll be able to prepare some things in advance and more quickly pull up the reference material you're going to need. This will in turn allow you to provide a more fulfilling and eventful adventure with respect to this portion of the campaign. However, in relation to the rivals, because there's a more raw emotional component to it that is being portrayed by each rival during this chapter, you're going to want to convey that to the players. There is the risk that some players might become uncomfortable with that depending on how you convey that emotion. So I suggest what you do is you listen to those players' responses, and if you feel that a given player is avoiding being involved in this section of the campaign, check to see if there's anything you can do to make it a little bit more comfortable for them. And that is only because some of the rivals do take directions that someone in your party might have had to deal with personally in the past, and it really could become very uncomfortable for them because of that. Other than that, you should have a pretty good time running through this particular section, so I'm going to move on to the next chapter. With respect to Chapter 6, this is where the party begins to make their way through the Netherdeep and towards the prison of the Apotheon. It is the last full dungeon crawl the party is going to make before they encounter the Apotheon, but there is a catch. The Netherdeep is an underwater realm in an extra-dimensional space, and as such, underwater combat, navigation, and survivability rules are going to come into play. This chapter is very good at explaining how to handle that because there are additional elements that you also need to consider for this section of the module, and that is primarily the water pressure being placed on the party because of the nature of that extra-dimensional space. There's also the additional ruidium element in much larger quantities that is also going to have an effect on the party, depending on how long they remain here, and what effects it will have overall, if they are not already under the effects of ruidium corruption. It is highly likely that one or more party members actually have items that are already corrupting them with that element. So you're going to have to take all of these into account if you haven't already been doing so. The party, in theory, should also see most, if not all, of the remaining visions that are going to relate to Elixion, depending on how thorough that party goes through this particular chapter. The goal of the party should be in relation to finding all of the required fragments, which will allow the party to enter the heart of the prison. And if they so choose, find additional shards along the way, because there is a minimum number of those fragments that are required in order to get into the prison. The shards are the triggers that enable viewing many of these visions that the party is going to see, though there are other triggers as well, but I'm going to leave those for you to find. And finally, before we move on to the final chapter, the rivals once again are in play during this chapter, and you are going to want to make sure you look into how they should be played, paying close attention to the rivals in the Netherdeep section of this chapter. Once again, you can move the rivals around and determine where the party is going to bump into them once again, if the rivals are still in play, and go from there. What do I mean by if the rivals are in play? Well, it's entirely possible that the rivals themselves don't make an appearance for the remaining duration of the campaign. It all comes down to the disposition of the party as well as their emotional states. If they completely broke in Chapter 5, there's a very good chance they are not involved in this chapter, or if they are, they're on an individual basis. And this is where that disposition of a rival party member towards a given party member comes into play, because they might decide to accommodate the party as they move forward through this section. Once you're comfortable with everything, just let the players guide the direction they take towards the final chapter, as that is going to ensure that their story is unique and entertaining, or potentially frustrating depending on how things fell in relation to the overall dice rolls or the information that they've discovered. Beyond that, there's nothing else I really need to cover in relation to this particular chapter, so let's move on to the next one. Chapter 7 is the final chapter of the campaign, and this is going to be where the party gets to make their choice and either run the risk of more harm to the world or curing it of its affliction. Before you run this chapter of the campaign, you're going to want to be sure you read through all of the sections within this chapter multiple times until you've almost got the information memorized. And the reason is, it's the only way to really prepare yourself for whatever outcome the party triggers by their choice. It's also going to reduce the delay in conveying those details to the party once done. And it's also going to provide you a mental framework of concepts and ideas that you can use to convey those changes to the party as they return to the world of Exandria. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's overly detailed. It can just be sort of like a mental concept or idea that you can use that might then trigger a huge blurb, if you will, when it comes to the description once you've figured out what choice they've made. However, I'm really not going to go into any details about the conclusions of this chapter, and that's to prevent spoilers for both the players and you, the Dungeon Master. As the DM, you've been just as involved through the entire story as the party has been. And as long as it's a story that you're interested in narrating, you've kind of invested a little bit into it. As a result, it is best that I leave most of the discovery of this chapter to you, and that's to help maintain the level of surprise and satisfaction, hopefully satisfaction, that you're going to feel when the party makes it to the stage of the campaign, and also what the surprise and potential satisfaction or fear of their conclusion is going to be. However, all of the information you need in order to run this last big encounter is defined within this chapter, but how you choose to run it is still entirely under your control, though guided by the actions of the players. This campaign is one of the most complicated campaigns I've ever read through, and it might even be more complicated than the Out of the Abyss campaign, even though it has less branching storylines. The results of this campaign are going to forever change your local version of Exandria, and it can and should diverge from the official stories told in generally the normal version of the world. This is, however, a good thing because it helps to breed new stories that you can then weave for your players, and find a new interesting way in order to keep your players engaged in that world, and have fun in the process. I want to thank you for watching this video, and I would like to thank Smiteworks for providing the module for me to be able to run this review. I hope you found the information in this video useful for you to be able to learn how to work this particular module, and if you did, feel free to click on the like button as well as potentially subscribe to the channel. I want to thank you for watching this video, and if you found the information useful, click on that like button as well as leave a comment below as it helps the channel gain exposure. Also, consider subscribing as I release content similar to this topic quite regularly on the channel.